Welcome to another deep dive, and today we're tackling a question that's fascinated, well, pretty much anyone who's ever thought about power. What role do militaries play when authoritarian regimes start to crumble?
It's funny. We often picture armies as these tools of repression, right?
Right.
The guys with the guns keeping the dictator in power.
Right, right.
But history's full of examples where they actually become the instruments of change.
Yeah, and today we're going to figure out how that happens.
Exactly.
Oh,
So you've given me this study, and it really zooms in on two super interesting cases. The Philippines back in 1986 and Indonesia in 1998.
okay.
In both situations, you had these massive protests that were basically threatening to topple these dictators who had been in charge for decades.
Yeah.
And in both cases, it was the military that ended up being the deciding factor. But the military didn't just come in and crush the uprisings like you might expect. Instead, what really mattered were these splits within the armed forces themselves.
Huh, okay. So you're saying it's not just about, like, how big or powerful a country's military is overall, but more about what's going on inside of it.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Think of it like a crack in a dam, right? It doesn't matter how thick and strong the wall is if there's a weakness that can be exploited.
Oh, I see.
And to add another layer, we should look at some contrasting cases too, right? Like Tiananmen Square in 1989 or the Gwangju Uprising in South Korea, where protests were met with, well, brutal force.
Right, right, yeah.
So our mission today is to figure out what's the difference between a military that cracks down on protesters and one that helps to bring about a transition? What makes some armies fracture under pressure while others stay solid?
That is fascinating. So let's start with this whole intramilitary conflict idea. Where did these fault lines come from? What makes a military vulnerable to these kinds of splits in the first place?
Right, well, you got to think about it from the dictator's perspective.
Okay.
One of the biggest fears any authoritarian leader has is a coup, right? Being overthrown by their own military. So to prevent that, they often use this divide and rule strategy.
Okay, how does that work?
Well, there are a few ways to do it. They might create these rival units within the military, kind of like giving them overlapping responsibilities so they're always competing with each other.
Ah, okay.
They'll promote officers based on loyalty rather than actual skill or experience.
Ah, yeah.
And sometimes they'll even try to stir up ethnic or religious divisions within the ranks.
Oh, wow.
It's all about making sure no one faction gets too powerful and that everyone's always looking over their shoulder.
So it's like a pressure cooker then, right? Everyone's competing for resources and influence.
Exactly.
But doesn't that make the whole system super unstable? I mean, at some point, doesn't it just blow up in the dictator's face?
Oh, absolutely. It's a super risky game. But for a while, it can work.
Hmm.
Keep everyone off balance.
Right.
The problem is that it inevitably creates winners and losers, right? You have the officers who are in the dictator's good graces, and then you have the ones who get sidelined or passed over for promotions.
Right, right.
And when a crisis hits, well, that's when things can get really interesting.
Because the people who feel like they've been mistreated, they might see a chance to change their situation.
Precisely. They start looking for an exit strategy.
Yeah.
And sometimes that means siding with the opposition.
Okay, so let's take this idea and apply it to our case studies then. The Philippines, in 1986, we've got President Marcos facing these huge protests after, well, let's be honest, a totally rigged election.
Right, yeah.
He orders the military to crack down, but things don't exactly go according to plan. Why? What happened?
So in the Philippines, you had this deep rivalry in the top of the military hierarchy.
Okay.
You had General Fabian Ver, the chief of staff, who was fiercely loyal to Marcos.
Mm-hmm.
He controlled a lot of the key units like the Presidential Security Command.
Right.
But then you also had Lieutenant General Fidel Ramos, who was this well-respected officer who had been kind of pushed aside by Marcos.
Okay. So Ramos is on the outs, but he's still a powerful figure.
Exactly. And Ramos, he was smart. He saw that Marcos's regime was weakening, and he knew he needed to protect himself.
Yeah.
So he starts building relationships with figures in the opposition.
Like who?
People in the Catholic Church, influential business leaders, anyone who was losing faith in Marcos.
Gotcha.
And he also understood the importance of international support.
Oh, interesting.
He quietly starts assuring the United States, who were by this point pretty worried about Marcos, that he could offer a more stable alternative.
So Ramos is very strategically positioning himself for, well, a potential power shift.
Exactly. He's playing the long game.
Okay, but how did this rivalry between Ver and Ramos actually lead to Marcos's downfall? Like, what was the tipping point?
Well, it all came to a head when Defense Minister Juan Ponce Enrile, another Marcos ally who had fallen out of favor,
Uh-huh.
joined forces with Ramos. Together, they publicly broke with Marcos and holed up in these two military camps in Manila. It was a huge gamble. They were basically daring the military to choose sides.
And that's what kicked off the people power revolution.
Yes. Marcos, he panicked. He ordered the military to attack the camps.
Oh, wow.
But then, the craziest thing happened. A lot of the soldiers just refused to fire on their comrades. Some units even turned their tanks around and joined the rebels.
Oh, wow.
And then you had these huge crowds of civilians inspired by the defections and urged on by the Catholic Church surrounding the camps to protect Ramos and Enrile. This emboldened even more soldiers to switch sides.
It's like a domino effect. Once a few key pieces fell, the whole thing started to unravel.
Exactly. And even some helicopter pilots defected, flew their aircraft right over to the rebel side.
Wow, it sounds like Marcos had totally lost control by this point.
He was finished. And the final nail in the coffin came when the United States, seeing that Marcos was done, publicly called on him to step down.
Oh, wow.
Facing opposition from both inside the military and the international community, Marcos fled into exile.
So the Philippines is like a textbook example of how a rivalry within the military, combined with a smart leader who knows how to build alliances and take advantage of a crisis, can bring down even a really powerful dictator.
Exactly. It shows you that power is often a lot more fragile than it looks.
Absolutely.
And, we see a similar pattern in Indonesia in 1998, although with its own unique twists and turns.
Okay, so before we jump into Indonesia, I think it's important to understand why the military didn't fracture in places like China in 1989. Was it just that the People's Liberation Army was more ideologically committed to the regime?
That's a common assumption, but the study we're looking at suggests it might be more about how these militaries are structured. China, like North Korea and a few other authoritarian states, they use this thing called a Leninist-style political commissar system within their armed forces.
A what? Can you explain that?
Sure. Basically, it means that alongside the normal chain of command, there's this whole parallel political structure within the military. You have these political officers who answer directly to the ruling party, and they're embedded at every level, from the smallest units all the way up to the top.
Huh.
And their job, well, it's to make sure everyone stays politically loyal, enforce the party line, and report on anyone who seems even a little bit suspicious.
So it's basically a way of keeping the military under the thumb of the party no matter what.
Exactly. It creates this really effective system of surveillance and control.
Yeah.
It makes it super hard for any kind of opposition to organize or gain any traction.
That makes sense when you think about Tiananmen Square then, right? The army stayed totally unified and, well, the results were tragic.
Exactly. And this system also helps to explain why things went so differently in the Philippines.
Right.
But it's not just about brainwashing soldiers with ideology. This political commissar system, it actually creates career incentives for officers who are politically reliable. So it's a more stable structure for the regime over the long haul.
That's a really important point. It's not just about loyalty. It's about how power is structured within the system itself.
Exactly. Now, turning back to Indonesia in 1998, we see a totally different kind of dynamic at play.
I'm definitely curious to hear about that. Let's dive into Indonesia. Okay, so Indonesia in 1998, we've got President Suharto, another longtime strongman facing student protests, and this time it's all happening right in the middle of the Asian financial crisis.
Yeah, the stakes were incredibly high.
For sure.
And at the heart of it all, you've got this rivalry between General Wiranto, the head of the armed forces, and Lieutenant General Prabowo Subianto.
Okay, Prabowo, he was a rising star, right? Even considered Suharto's possible successor.
Yeah, he's married to Suharto's daughter, so definitely seen as a favorite.
Yeah.
But what made this rivalry so different from the one we talked about in the Philippines, well, Prabowo was just incredibly ambitious.
Yeah, ambitious how?
Like, he wasn't content to just wait his turn. He truly believed he should be the next president, and he was willing to do whatever it took to make that happen. He started courting these hardline Islamic factions within the military.
Oh, wow, playing with fire there.
Yeah, this made a lot of people nervous, especially in a military that had always been pretty secular.
Yeah.
Prabowo even went so far as to order the kidnapping of some student activists.
What? Seriously?
Yep, he was trying to create this image of himself as the tough guy, the one who could restore order.
Wow. So Prabowo's not just vying for power within the military, he's actively trying to manipulate the crisis to his advantage.
Exactly. Very dangerous game.
Okay, so what's Wiranto doing while all this is going on? How does he respond to Prabowo's power grab?
Wiranto was in a really tough spot.
Yeah.
He knew that Suharto was losing his grip on power.
Right.
But he also knew that if he openly challenged Suharto, it could be the end of his own career.
Sure.
So he had to be smart about it.
Okay, so what does he do?
He starts reaching out to the very groups that Suharto had alienated, the student protesters and Nahdlatul Ulama. Yeah, it's this powerful Islamic organization that Suharto had basically pushed to the sidelines.
Oh, interesting.
Radu realized that to have any power in a post-Suharto world, he needed to build alliances with these groups.
That's fascinating. So while Prabowo is doubling down on repression and trying to appeal to Suharto's hardline base, Wiranto is quietly laying the groundwork for a transition by siding with the people who want change.
Yeah, you could even say he was playing this good cop, bad cop routine with Prabowo.
Except with, like, the future of Indonesia hanging in the balance.
Right, exactly.
Hmm.
And it's important to remember that Wiranto wasn't starting from scratch with these groups. You know, there were these back channels between military intelligence and student groups that had existed for years.
Wait, really? I thought those kinds of connections were just for, surveillance and keeping tabs on dissent.
That's usually how it works, yeah.
Right.
But in this case, they actually provided an opening for Wiranto to start a dialogue, build some trust, and eventually forge a common front.
Wow. So those back channels, meant to control dissent, actually end up facilitating it in this case. It really shows that even in these super repressive systems, there are always these little cracks where opposition can take root.
Absolutely. And when Suharto finally orders Wiranto to impose martial law.
Which would have given Prabowo even more power.
Right, exactly. Wiranto refuses.
He just flat out says no.
Pretty much. He knew that a full-blown crackdown would only make things worse. Turn more people against the regime and really destabilize the whole country.
Yeah.
So he actually allows the protest to continue
Really?
and even provides some logistical support to the students who are occupying the parliament building.
He's taking a huge risk there.
Oh, for sure. It was a total gamble,
Ah.
but it paid off big time.
Because it showed everyone where he stood.
Exactly. Wiranto was making it clear that he was siding with the people, not with the dying regime.
Okay, so Suharto eventually resigns. What happens next? Who fills that power vacuum?
Well, the vice president, who had initially promised Prabowo he'd get the top job, he suddenly changes his mind
Why?
because he sees the writing on the wall. He realizes that Wiranto, who now has the support of the streets and key parts of the military, is the much safer bet.
Wow.
Prabowo, who's now isolated and discredited, he's forced to back down.
So just like in the Philippines, we see this combination of internal rivalries, strategic alliances, and a willingness to break with the old guard that allows a military leader to not only survive regime change, but actually become a major player in the new system. But does this mean that these generals were like secretly pro-democracy all along, or were they just looking out for themselves?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And it's one that historians are still debating today.
Yeah,
It's possible that some of these officers genuinely sympathized with the pro-democracy movements.
sure.
But for a lot of them, it was probably more about pragmatism. They saw which way the wind was blowing and realized that siding with the forces of change was the best way to protect their own careers and maybe even gain more power.
So less about ideology and more about just navigating the shifting tides of power. These guys were playing a high-stakes game of survival, betting on who they thought would come out on top.
That's a great way to put it. And that actually raises another important question. What happens after the dictator falls? How do these militaries, who've now tasted political power, how do they behave in a new democratic system?
Do they go back to the barracks? Or do they try to hold on to that influence?
Right. And that's where things get even more complicated because some militaries might be willing to step back and let democracy take root.
Yeah.
But others, they might try to cling to power using their influence to shape the new system in ways that benefit them.
Right.
And they can have a huge impact on whether a country can actually transition to a stable democracy.
Man, this is so interesting. It makes me think that understanding these transitions isn't just about analyzing the big moments of upheaval, It's also about looking at the long game.
Absolutely.
Like, how do these events shape the institutions and the balance of power in the years that follow?
It's about the legacy of those choices, the ripple effects,
Right.
and that's where the real complexity lies.
This has been such an eye-opening discussion. We've seen how these internal divisions, these strategic alliances, even these seemingly small decisions can have a massive impact on the direction of history. But I think the biggest thing I'm taking away from this is that understanding these transitions means we need to look beyond these simplistic narratives of good guys and bad guys.
It's not that simple.
Right.
You got to dig deeper.
Yeah, it's about recognizing the complex motivations, the constantly shifting alliances, and this constant struggle for power that's going on behind the scenes.
That's what really shapes these moments of upheaval.
It's fascinating, honestly.
Yeah, history's rarely black and white.
Yeah, it really is like peeling back the layers of an onion, you know? You think you understand what's going on,
Yeah.
but then there's always another layer of complexity underneath.
Exactly. And the more we understand these dynamics, I think the better equipped we are to navigate a world where power's always in flux.
Yeah.
The future is always uncertain.
So for someone listening to this right now, what's the one big takeaway? What's the so what that can help them understand the world around them better?
I'd say the biggest takeaway is to never underestimate the power of those subtle dynamics, those hidden alliances, the personal ambitions that are often driving events behind the scenes.
Right.
Whether we're talking about governments, companies, or even just social groups. Paying attention to those undercurrents can give you a real advantage in understanding how things work and where they might be going.
It's kind of like that old saying, follow the money, except in this case, it's more like follow the power.
Yeah, exactly. Who has it, who wants it, and what are they willing to do to get it?
That's the question.
And if you can understand those dynamics, well, you might just be able to predict the next big shakeup. The next time the landscape shifts in a way no one saw coming.
Man, this has been such an insightful deep dive. It's really given us a whole new way to think about how these seemingly solid structures can just collapse when those internal fault lines are exposed.
It's all about pressure points.
Right.
And timing.
Exactly. I know I'll never look at a military or any power structure the same way again.
I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah.
And remember, these dynamics, they're not just limited to these big historical events.
Right.
They're happening all around us every day. So keep your eyes open, stay curious, and never stop asking questions.
That's great advice. Thanks so much for joining us on this fascinating exploration of power intrigue and the surprising role that militaries can play in shaping history.
My pleasure.
And for everyone listening, we hope this deep dive has given you some food for thought as you go out and navigate your own world. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.